Shalom Aleichem, welcome. Ich heiße Vivian Felsen und es ist mein großes Kavod, euch zu begrüßen im Namen von dem Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto UJA Federation. My name is Vivian Felsen and it is my privilege to welcome you today on behalf of the Toronto UJA Committee for Yiddish. It's wonderful to have so many people with us today and from 3 different countries so far. We don't know yet who else will be joining. But before we begin, I want to remind you to put any comments or questions that you have in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Our speaker will have the opportunity to look at your comments and your questions after the presentation. Today's program is one that I personally have been looking forward to. First of all, I was really impressed the first time I heard Eliyana speak on Zoom about Polish Jewish refugees in Soviet Central Asia during World War II, a topic which I think has been largely neglected in the history of the Holocaust. Her topic today, the Yizkor Bikher, or memorial books created after World War II to memorialize the hundreds of destroyed Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, is also one that has not gotten enough attention over the 60 years or more of their existence. So to introduce our guest speaker, I will now call on Miri Corral, the CEO and founding director of the California Institute for Yiddish Culture, known as CYCLE in Los Angeles. Miri is a professor of Yiddish at UCLA, a popular Yiddish instructor, a prize-winning bilingual writer, a poet, a translator, and the organizer of today's event. Miri.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vivian. And I apologize in advance if you hear some barking in the background. That just adds a little flavor from Venice, California. So, seid begrüßt, everyone. Welcome to our program today. Memory books, Yizkor Bikher, Untapped Treasure of the Last Collected Memories of a Vanished Civilization. We are so looking forward to hearing from our speaker today, Dr. Eliyana Adler, who I will tell you about in just a moment. I want to first of all just thank you for being here live, lebendig, with us today, lebendigkeit. And thanks for watching, to all those who'll be watching the recording. You're about to hear a truly fascinating talk about a topic that not only furthers our understanding of what, for many of us, is the world of our recent ancestors, but also about the sheer and truly miraculous willpower of rescuing from the ashes as much of that lost world as possible. I myself in this home have 2 Yizkor Bikher, one from Skarżyska Kamienna and one from Szelps, both in Poland. Those are the shtetl that my family came from, and I always was fascinated by how they came into being, and so hopefully we'll hear more about that in a few moments. I also want to thank our wonderful co-sponsor, the Toronto UJA Committee for Yiddish, for being our host today. In particular, my colleague Vivian Felsen and our behind-the-scenes technical whiz and Yiddish teacher, Sharon Power. Our partnership seemingly knows no bounds, for I'm excited to tell you about 2 more programs coming up. On May 12th, program entitled Heroism of Life Itself, Heldigkeit von Leben allein, that is about women's individual and collective resistance during the Holocaust, in addition to an update about Poland, about Jewish culture in Poland today. And this will be presented by, from Berlin, from historian, artist, and activist Susanna Hertzberg. And on a completely different and intriguing topic, on June 2nd, Also, both of these are online, and at the same time as this event, there'll be a program called How to Tell Your Fortune in Yiddish. Wie man lässt sich voraussagen das Mazel of Yiddish, which is presented by from Israel this time by Samuel Glauber. Both of those talks will be in English, so if you're Yiddish challenged, no problem. And stay tuned, of course, for additional detailed announcements about these programs. So now, it's my great pleasure and really honor to introduce today's speaker. Eliyana Adler is Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the Pennsylvania State University and teaches and studies East European Jewish history. Her 2020 book, Survival on the Margins, Polish Jewish Refugees in the Wartime Soviet Union, won the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research, as well as the Rachel Feldhay Brenner Award in Polish Jewish Studies. She's also the author of In Her Hands, The Education of Jewish Girls in Tsarist Russia, and the co-editor of several books, including most recently, Entanglement of War, Social Networks in Eastern Europe During the Holocaust, which was published by Yad Vashem Press. She's published articles in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Yad Vashem Studies, East European Jewish Affairs, Poland, Jewish Social Studies, and many other journals, and held fellowships sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, the German Historical Institute, and a Fulbright, among other institutions. Dr. Adler's current work focuses on the topic today, post-Holocaust Jewish, Polish Jewish memorial books. So it is my great privilege to introduce Eliyana Adler.
Thank you so much, Miri, and thank you, Vivian and Sharon, for inviting me and setting this up. I'm pleased to be here and be speaking about a topic which is very close to my heart. Let me now just show my slides. All right. So, many years ago, when I was in right before I started graduate school, so in between my undergraduate degree and I was applying to graduate school, I had a job in a academic library doing cataloging, and I was entirely entry level. So my job was the books came across my desk and I put in the most obvious information. It was Judaica books, but things that anyone could figure out, the title, the author. And then my supervisor would put in the more complicated Library of Congress number and all those things. One day, a book came across my desk that was impossible to categorize. It had 3 title pages, one in Yiddish and Hebrew, one in Hebrew, both on the right side, and on the left side, one in English. It wasn't clear which title to put in. There were a whole bunch of authors. Even the language wasn't clear because it was it was in several different languages. That it was a book like no other. It didn't fit many of the categories and understandings of books. It was a lot of text, but also a lot of images. I was utterly transfixed, and I spent the rest of the afternoon looking at what was a Yizkor Bikher, a memorial book. At the time, although I was applying to graduate school in East European Jewish Studies, it didn't occur to me that I could study these books. So that was many years ago. In the intervening time, I've used these books in my teaching. I bring them into the classroom. I've used them for my research on various projects, but only fairly recently did it occur to me that I could actually study Yizkor Bikher, that they themselves could be my subject of study. So that's what I'm doing now and what I'll be speaking about. And basically, as you can see from this slide, I want to talk about just what they are, how we might define them, as well as how these books have evolved over time and some of the areas of research that I'm working on and that all of you might be interested in also. So to begin with defining these books, the Yiddish, Yizkor Buch or Yizkor Bikher, the plural, the Hebrew, Sifrei Zikaron, English, memorial book, all of these words can mean many things. A yearbook might be a memorial book. A photo album might be a personal Yizkor Buch. So I want to be clear that the particular genre that I'm looking at and that most people mean when they say Yizkor Buch, although there are, there's room for some disagreement. But the books that I'm looking at are communal, collaborative, and commemorative. So they are communal in the sense that they commemorate one community. I'm interested in these books, and most of the Yizkor Bikher are about a single place and the Jewish community that existed there. They are collaborative in the sense that rarely are these books, there are some, but rarely are they single authored. Sometimes there is a single editor, but a single book might have contributions from 20, 40, 100 different people. So they're collaborative projects, and they're commemorative because the chief goal, and I do think that there are, in many ways, there are many purposes, and I will speak more about the purposes of these books, but they're commemorating lost communities. They're commemorating what all of these, whoever the survivors were and the refugees were, the world that they left behind and everyone and everything in it. And here we see, for example, an image of the Pietrkovers, so Jews from Pietrkov Tribunalski in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, meeting together. So the collaborative part of these books was mainly done in the under the auspices of the Landsmannschaften, the hometown community organizations. So to speak now about the purpose, the books have introductions, almost always, that describe some of the purposes, but they're multifaceted, and also each book is different, although there are certain commonalities that we can talk about all of them. So they use different words, different languages, and images to try and explain essentially how these books can serve as a monument for their destroyed hometown communities. Often they use symbolism and metaphors of gravestone. That's certainly the most popular, but also of a ner tamid, of a eternal light. So these are just a few examples that I've given us to look at, and we won't read them all because we have a lot of topics to cover. But if we look at the one on the far right there, written by Rabbi Dov Varshavsky, so this is his foreword to the book from Der Hitchen, 500 Jahre Yiddish Leben, which is a community which is now in Belarus. The town is, although it was in the interwar period, it was in Poland. So he says here, there can be no better or more enduring monument than this Yizkor book. It is a gravestone of holy letters that can never be erased. Gravestones of wood and stone are not immortal. Wood rots and burns. Stones can be dug up and broken off. A gravestone of letters, however, lives forever. So again, it's his particular formulation, but a common theme is to suggest that these books are better than monuments of stone, that they will last longer, that they serve other purposes, and yet that they are monuments. And we can talk more about purpose, but moving on now to contents. what's actually in the book. How do you make a monument out of words? So in keeping with the stated goal of preserving the memory of these towns, and also the commemorative nature of the process, most of the memorial books are devoted to pre-war Jewish life. And that might be surprising in that we might think that a lot of them would be about the Holocaust. But if we look at this one example here of Pinchas Benjamin, basically the section on the Holocaust is in Ches. So only, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, all of the other letters are about other aspects of this town's history, and only the 8th section deals with the Holocaust. And that's fairly common. Just each one, again, percentages differ, but that what's included is all sorts of material about that community when it was alive, rather than only about its death. The books are mostly words, but also a lot of images of different sorts. So I've given you just some examples here. In the top right-hand corner is a historical document. Sometimes the committees putting these books together were able to find relevant documents and images that show the past history, previous centuries of what life was like for Jews in that town. There's also a lot of artwork contributed by people who lived there. So on the bottom right, from Pinchas Zamosh, is a beautiful picture of the town square, very famous, very lovely, charming town square in Zamosh, contributed by someone remembering that place. That was, people could write, they could send in photographs, or they could express themselves in other ways. Memory maps are a common feature of the books. There are some that make some effort to scale, or to have north, south, east, west, to try and feature some of the features of what we might expect from a map. But many of them are much more folk maps. If you see this one, this is from Jedwabne in northeastern Poland, for example. The houses, trees, windmills. It's very kind of folk art. There's even a dog there. You get a sense of the place, but also in many of these maps, and this one is included, that sort of beauty of the pre-war period gets broken. And in the bottom right-hand corner of this map, you'll see a barn, which is on fire, and that's the infamous way in which many of the Jews in Jedwabne were killed, famously, as Jan Gross put it, by their neighbors in 1941. On the left-hand side are photographs, and these were contributed by people who survived, oftentimes by family members who had received these photographs in the mail from their family who were still in the home country, even though they had settled elsewhere. So in this case that we can see here, which is Radom, they've put all the photographs together. They had a whole photo section. I'd say it's a little more common in the books to spread them throughout and have photographs throughout the book, but different ways of including images amongst the words. People often ask about numbers. How many of these books were there? And partly it depends on how you define them. If we only, my particular interest, as I said, is in the ones created by Landsmannschaft. And so that's, there are, say, 1,000. Some people have said there's many of 1,000 post-Holocaust memorial books. But if we say just those from Landsmannschaft, and that cuts the numbers down, maybe 700. If we say just those in Poland, maybe 500. Certainly most of the Yizkor Bikher that are around a single place, those are places in the pre-war borders of Poland. So if you look at this map, for example, those of you who know the post-war borders of Poland will recognize that the territory on the east is no longer in Poland. It's now Belarus and Ukraine, whereas some of the western parts became Poland after the war. So the changing borders, but this just gives us a sense. Scholar Adam Kopczowski in Lublin in Poland actually put together this very detailed, remarkable map of all of the Polish Yizkor books. And it's hard, I think, for you to see this. It's hard for me to see this also. But this is in his book, and I've written the title of the book there. It's a Polish language book that he edited together with Monika Adamczyk-Karbowska. In his book, you can see more closely this map. It's also color-coded. So, for example, towns that have more than one book about them. And it's interesting to see. Again, one could spend a lot of time on the map that we might expect, like, sure, Krakow, of course, there's going to be 3 books or more written about Krakow. But Sierps, which Miri mentioned, also has 3 books written about it. Not such a big and important place, but nonetheless, just, and sometimes some of these towns that have books about them were tiny. Their Jewish communities were minuscule, and yet they were able to create these books in the post-war period. The heyday of Yizkor Bikher, of creating them, of publishing them, was certainly the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In those years, each subsequent Landsmannschaft was pushed by the success of other Landsmannschaften to want to write and create their own book. And you can see that pressure in the last paragraph of a review here. So the book of Kutna, Sefer Kutna, had come out in 1968, and this is in the Yiddish paper Arbeiterwort from Paris. And the author, Lamed Makovsky, writes at the bottom, the book of Kutna and Surroundings, published in both our languages, Yiddish and Hebrew, is without a doubt among the best books in our memorial and Holocaust literature. Let us hope that the Landsmannschaften that have still not memorialized their hometowns will take an example from the community of Kutna and its area. So it was not just within single Landsmannschaften, but there's communication across them where they're aware of who's putting out a book, and the reviews are being published around the world in different Yiddish papers, even if the book might have come out only in one of those countries. As more and more Landsmannschaften succeeded in putting out Yizkor volumes, other ones followed them, and this continued through the 1970s and into the 80s. But by that time, most of the refugee, survivor, immigrant generation had died or no longer had the energy to pursue these very demanding volunteer projects. Their children, born and raised often in new countries, didn't have the same relationship with their communities of origin. So both the Yizkor Bikher themselves and the Landsmannschaften really dwindled in the final decades of the 20th century, not disappearing entirely in many cases. There are still Landsmannschaften existing, but many did disappear in those years. And the books also became less popular in many ways. I now want to talk about the evolution of these volumes over the time of their existence in a little bit more depth. So the very first Yizkor books to come out that are post-Holocaust were immediately after the war, that is 46, 47. So obviously in that amount of time, people couldn't put together too much material. But I think it's important to realize that the motivation was there, that these communities wanted already to make monuments that were books. So the examples we see right here, Podlasha in Umkum, for example, was published in Munich in a DP camp. Others were published in new communities where refugees were settling, but where also refugees had settled before the war. So the book of Ondenk Novi Dvor, for example, was published in Los Angeles. And Churban Vilna was published in New York right after the war by Shmerka Kostrzecinski, who was both a well-known partisan fighter and also an ethnomusicologist. So these books largely are single-authored. One person had the energy and put them together. But at the same time, one person never really would have been able to bring together enough materials. So they tended, even in these cases, to really rely on others in their greater community. Kostrzecinski, for example, gathered some Soviet documents before he left Europe, and but once he was in New York, he was able to gather more documents there from his friends and colleagues. So it's still, there are communal and aspects as well as collaborative aspects. Okay, so those are the very first versions. Then there is an expansion and development of the genre. One of the questions that that I'm trying to work on as I do research for this project, for my own book about the Yizkor books, is where did the idea come from? How did they know after the war to put together these volumes? And certainly one of the, and I'm not the only one, and other scholars have pointed to other kind of sources for the Yizkor books, including some ancient and medieval Jewish genres of memorial writing. But certainly another one was Landsmannschaft writing and literature, and particularly the banquet books that many Landsmannschaften in outside of Europe, of people made up of people who all came from the same place in Europe and joined together, had yearly balls or fundraisers or events where they had a journal or some kind of booklet that they put together. So these are two examples, both from New York, but these things were going on in other parts of the world also. And you can see the Khmelnyk Souvenir Journal and the Yovel book from Girardov, both aesthetically, if any of you have ever opened a Yizkor book, look very similar. The kind of funerary art, the style of decoration is quite similar, and also some of the contents, the things that they wrote about, and the combination also, and this exists in the, even though these are pre-war books, a lot of nostalgia and writing about the beauty of these places and wonderful stories from their childhood, but also an awareness of sadness and difficulty that went on in those places as well. So, and the other thing that these souvenir journals have in common, of course, is that they were collaborative, that different voices, different people contributed to them, and that many of them weren't artists or writers, but nonetheless, they had something to say to their own community. These were internal documents. And so many of these factors would be transferred to the post-war memorial books as well. Oh, not quite there yet. Okay. So So there's this period of great expansion, as I said, the 50s, 60s, 70s, where the Yizkor Bikher get bigger and thicker, and they contain more and more photographs and writing, and people, especially as the Landsmannschaft, their early purpose was to help new arrivals. But as there weren't many new arrivals coming during those decades, most of the refugees got out of the DP camps, out of Europe, and settled in new countries, that they needed in some ways a new goal, a new purpose, and memorialization became a lot of what they did. And these books were sometimes the most important post-war activities after taking care of refugees for these organizations. But by the 1970s, the number of books coming out each year had begun to decline. And the members with the strongest memories, of course, were also getting older. So this could have been the end of the story, that the Yizkor books were important to this one generation. They needed them and they created them, but their children weren't that interested on the whole. They were written in Yiddish, which many of their children didn't know, in rather old-fashioned Hebrew. Anyone who's looked at the Hebrew, it's people who went to, got a very good education in Hebrew in interwar Poland, but it's a kind of stilted, old-fashioned Hebrew that isn't the Hebrew of their children in Israel, for those who settled and wrote in Israel and wrote in Hebrew. And the books could have just sort of faded out of existence. But interestingly, they have had an afterlife. And in a number of different ways. And one of those ways, and again, some of you might already be very involved in this and know quite a lot about it, is for genealogists. Jewish genealogists discovered the Yizkor books and just how much information they contain about all of these towns, and began studying them, using them, and translating them. And at first, this was often happening sort of singly, bit by bit. People were translating the parts that were of interest to them, that were useful to them. But eventually, Jewish Gen was able to get permission, legal permission, to post translations of these books, because essentially they weren't under copyright any longer. And now many of the books, certainly not all of them, have been partially translated, and quite a few have been fully translated and are now coming out, and one can buy them in full English translations. The translations are mixed in terms of quality. Some are better than others, and they're not literary translations. In most cases, they're pretty quick translations to allow people access to information, because the people who are using this for genealogical purposes, they want facts and places and dates, and they don't necessarily need the quality of the poetry to be at the highest level. So that was the first level of their afterlife. And then the next step is that once these translations were online, they become available to the world at large. Everyone can find them, can search for them and find them. And so people in those communities, people who are from those places and still live there, non-Jews, began to discover these translations online of a part of their own towns that they knew in many cases nothing about. And so there's a whole kind of sub-community of people who I call memory activists in Poland today, who have taken on the history, the Jewish history of their towns, and wanting to share it, to make it available, to teach other people in their communities about what interwar Poland and what Polish history was like, and what a much more multi-ethnic Poland was like. And so the images that you see here are, on the one hand, a page of translations that can all be purchased of different Yizkor books into English. And on the right-hand side, a partial translation of a Yizkor book into Polish from Wojsławice. And in this case, it's part of a museum exhibition that there's Wojsławice is a tiny little town not too far from Lublin. And the municipal museum there is in the old synagogue. It's a lovely building. And one of the exhibitions there is about Jewish life. And the creators have taken some of, not all of, but some of the pages of the Yizkor book, and they put on one side the original and on the other side the Polish, and people can flip through it and sort of get a sense of what this book was and what it can tell them about their own town. And so that's a whole other kind of area in terms of the diverse ways that people are using Yizkor Bikher today. There are, from my perspective, and Miri hinted at this also, there's so much more work that can be done about Yizkor Bikher. There's so much more research. My own interest is historical, but I just wanted to point out some of the ways, and there are people beginning to work in some of these areas, but the linguistics, you'll find in certain of the books, for example, terms, Yiddish terms that don't exist in any dictionary, that if you can't find someone from that town, you might never figure out what that word is, but that someone from that town might be someone Polish. That is, there's some local terms that are only known by people who live there. There's a lot of interesting research in that area to do, which is, beyond my own areas, but I think is important and interesting. The names of people and of places. There's quite a lot of literature, quite a lot of folklore. People talk about healing methods, for example, in the Yizkor Bikher. What was the local midwife or the local Feldhay? How did they heal people? What tinctures and poultices did they use? The maps are fascinating. So there's definitely a lot more. And of course, the art. And I've given just one example here of some of the art that you find in these books. Some of it is very simple and not of the greatest quality, and some of it is really powerful. And those who are in the field of visual studies, I think, could learn a lot from these books and how people expressed their pain, not only in writing, but also in images. And of course, memory. How does one remember a town that still exists? Because of course, almost all of these places, you can go and visit them, but the town that they're writing about, you can't visit. It doesn't exist. So that complicated way in which they're writing about the memory and talking about the death and the destruction of the place, even though the place lives on in certain ways and certain people from there. I can say lots more about these books. I want to, in a moment, open this up for questions, but just to respond proactively to some of the questions, I want to show you a couple of useful resources. The New York Public Library has digitized not all, but most of the Yizkor Bikher. And you can use their Yizkor book collection and search by place and open and look at the books online in their original language. They have also shared those files with the National Yiddish Book Center. So you can also find them there. I would say the software they use is a little bit more user-friendly. It's a little bit easier to flip through the books on the National Yiddish Book Center page than on the New York Public Library page. And then, of course, Jewish Gen, which I mentioned, has partial and complete translations. The necrology, that is the list of names of the dead, they have rendered into Latin characters for all of the books that they have access to, whereas most of the rest of the material, some has been translated and some hasn't, and it's done entirely on a volunteer basis. That is, anyone within the Jewish Gen community can take charge of the translation of one of those books, can either pay people or on their own translate it and make it available. So those are all useful resources to go to find out more and to learn about the towns that our own families are from. So that's a quick introduction to these books and to some of what interests me about them, but I'm also happy to entertain questions and hear about what interests you about them as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Eliyana. It's such incredibly rich material. And I know, you know, you've been working on this for a while, and I have a feeling that when you get to your book, you're going to have to like choose what not to include, right? Because you can go in so many different directions and so much. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah.
I keep getting interested in particular topics about them and doing a whole bunch of research on that and then realizing it's tangential. I'm just going to publish an article about that. And then the book has to be more narrow. I can't fit everything that's interesting about them. And of course, there are other scholars working on them also. I don't have to do it all myself, but they are really fascinating.
Yeah. I have one question that has come up for me, which is related to the politics of the Yizkor Bikher, and which is also somewhat probably related to the funding of the Landsmannschaften, or the funding of the creation of these books, right? I'm sure you've come across this. I mean, certainly in my family, you know, relatives who did not want to contribute to the Yizkor Bikher, you know, because of the funding or because of who was in charge or whatever, you know, so that kind of stuff. So what can you enlighten us about that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So you get a hint of this in the introductions. Oftentimes they say something like, "We're sorry for anyone who got inadvertently left out," or they say, "This took a lot of years and was really difficult to do." So you get a sense that there's a lot of drama going on behind the scenes, but in the books themselves, that's mostly not visible. So it comes out more in the interviews and stories and the way people, right, the family stories, the way people talk about these books. There are a few, you know, more famous cases, but I would say if the most of the Yizkor books were published, the Polish ones were published in Israel, not all, but most of them, the majority. And it's hardly surprising that those people who went to Israel after the war were most interested in the Zionist past of the towns. And so you would think that the youth groups were mostly just Zionist ones, if you look at a lot of those books, whereas the Bundists and certainly the communists might not appear at all or might get much shorter shrift than, say, some of the books published in Paris, where there's a lot more space and attention given to the communists, so much so that they actually, you know, they left out people whom they didn't like. So there's some literal politics in terms of the groups that they were involved in. And then there's also, as you also hint at, some financial politics and sort of power plays with going on with money as well. And those are also difficult to see directly, but it's more from the stories in different families that one gets a hint. But although the books were often published in Israel, a lot of the financing for them was often coming from North America. And not surprisingly, North American Jews wanted, say, an English section in the back, so that their children and grandchildren might be able to read a little bit. And they wanted a lot of, more Yiddish than often the Israeli groups wanted. They would have been happy to put it out entirely in Hebrew, but because of the selections being sent in from Buenos Aires, from Toronto, from the United States, a lot of the books, even published in Israel, were half and half Yiddish and Hebrew. So it's a compromise.
What about the German reparation money? Was that going toward these as well? Are you aware at all?
That was not going directly to the publication of these. In some cases later on, it was being used for their dispersal. So the state of Israel actually kind of bought up some of them and sent them around to libraries around the world using some of that reparations money. But these are really self-funded.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment about the usefulness of these books for what people can find in them. When I have a grandfather who came from the Belarus area, was part of Poland at the time, and settled in Montreal early in the century. And before World War I, and he became a writer. And when I translated his books and I wanted to know more about his biography, where I found the information was in the Yizkor books. And it was just by chance that I found the Yizkor book of Lechovich, the town that he was from. There aren't many of them around. They were not digitized yet. I could not go online. I had to actually find a library or a person that had these books. So luckily I found that book. And from that book, I could find every single teacher that he had from the age of 4, 5, 6, going to Hager. They're all listed there. So I could figure out my grandfather's education as a little boy. Then he went to the Lida Yeshiva at age 13. And luckily, a neighbor of mine happened to have the Lida Yizkor book. These were days when I couldn't just go and find it. So there I discovered what his education was like in the Lida Yeshiva, who taught him Russian and how Rabbi Reines taught the boys about politics. And every single teacher that they had was in the Yizkor book. So these books are really amazing and fascinating and extremely useful. And now they're much easier to access. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in their family history, look them up. You'll probably find translations into English at Jewish Gen, because so much of it is being done as we speak. So I just wanted to mention that before we go to our questions. And we should have a look at what some of the questions are.
I mean, yes, absolutely. There's so much there. And I think it's also worth mentioning, though, that, and this is part of the reason that historians have been a little suspicious of them, is that a lot of that material was put together just by somebody. Somebody just put together a list of who were the teachers in that town, and they might have left people out, and they might have gotten the dates wrong, and they might have not liked somebody and not put them on the list. So it's as a historical source, it's problematic. But of course, all historical sources are problematic. Every source has its own agenda. So it's just something we need to keep in mind, that they are very much folk documents and very valuable ones.
Right. It's true. Yeah. But as you say, everything that we find, we have to be a little skeptical of, even nowadays, looking at newspapers and which paper do we trust? What do we trust? So I think on the whole that I like to believe that their intentions were honorable when they submitted information. And, you know, I've had the pleasure of translating some of them and knowing some of the people who contributed to some of these books. And yeah, so Miri, should we start with
Yeah, we should probably, yeah. So a few questions have shown up in the Q&A. Maybe you can see them, Eliyana, but I'll just read a few of them. So the first one from Miriam Bachra. Hi, Miriam. Are all of the Yizkor books on the Kutna map and or your work listed in the Jewish Gen project? Does that make sense to you? The Yizkor books on the Kutna map.
So that map that I showed, the question is, does it show all of those books? Was that the question?
Yes. Is that map of the Yizkor books listed in the Jewish Gen project?
That map is not on Jewish Gen. No, it's in this Polish language book, Tam Bilkedesh Moidom, by Adam Kopczowski. But Jewish Gen, I mean, there are different lists, and the lists change because it partly depends on what people consider to be a Yizkor book. So there isn't kind of one singular agreed upon accounting, but Jewish Gen you can list by country. You can look at all the books from Ukraine, those that are not translated, partially translated, fully translated. So you can look by country, you can look, there's different search methods there. So it is very useful, but it doesn't have that same map on it.
No. Yeah, Miriam is clarifying is whether the books are on Jewish Gen. And yes, it sounds like they are.
Yes.
Yeah, the books are on Jewish Gen. But your best source for those who have questions about that is what Eliyana posted earlier, which is the New York Public Library and the Yiddish Book Center are your two best sources for the digitized books. Not all of them, as she said, but a good chunk of them are available in that way if you want to, search for ones that you're interested in. Sandra asks, how were the Yizkor books sold and distributed? Now that's an interesting question. And she says she has a memory of the rabbi making a trip from Israel yearly for donations, but he already had the book in hand. And that was in the early 1950s.
Yeah. So the books were often sold by subscription even before they were published. So people were asked to contribute sometimes over time, like piecemeal every year for a few years, or sometimes all at once through their Landsmannschaft toward the creation of the books. And then after the book was completed, they were advertised widely in the Yiddish newspapers all over the world, because, of course, some people were members of the Landsmannschaft of a certain town and some people weren't, but they might still be interested in purchasing the book. So they were marketed really for people from that town primarily. And then sometimes those people would then donate it to a library also. And then sometimes the State of Israel also donated them to some libraries, like the Library of Congress. So they did make it into some library collections, but that wasn't really I would say the books were aimed at their own communities. They were mostly internal. And then they've become more and more widely used and read, which is in itself interesting in a number of different ways. When we think about a book that was written for people who were from that place, there's a lot that's not explained, because everyone knows where the river was, and everyone knows where the synagogue was, and everyone knows who the rabbi was. They didn't need to go into a lot of that because it was obvious to them. And that's a more positive side, but also on a more negative side, I would say, some of the anger that comes out in those books. It's not clear to me if people would have wanted that translated widely and available, for example, for everyone to read, because they were writing for their own community.
It's interesting. I can give an example of somebody who had been, I don't know if he's still doing this, he took it upon himself to translate Yizkor books that were of interest to him, and they were large ones. And I don't know if you know about Jack Berger. He was a friend of Fischl Kuttner, and he translated, well, the one that I know especially is the Baranovich Yizkor book. And he collected money, and I donated to that book because Baranovich was the city next to Lechovich, where the residents of Lechovich eventually ended up in Baranovich. And so a lot of the people from Lechovich are in the Baranovich. So I contributed to that. And I have a big, thick, leather-bound volume that he translated. And it's the kind of translation that the Polish historians complain about, because he didn't bother about spellings. He didn't bother about getting the Polish names correct. He didn't bother even about the language so much. He was interested in getting this done as quickly as possible. And he went from one Yizkor book to another. So he took it on himself to do it, but he collected money from people. And then after the book was published, I got my big copy of the Baranovich Yizkor book.
Yeah, oh, that's a wonderful example, because it's the
Right.
second generation.
That's
That's not the original, but the translation also coming out and being spread about and being money collected.
Exactly.
Yeah, so along those lines, Cheryl asks, since there are so many left to be translated into any language, other than Yiddish and Hebrew, is there any organized effort to get them translated? Any kind of centralized fundraising or call for translators that you're aware of?
The most centralized source that I'm aware of is Jewish Gen, which is collecting, oftentimes, individuals translated just one story for their own purposes, to put in their own book, for their own family. And they're trying to bring that all together so that everyone can share it and crowdsource what people have already done. And I think are doing a remarkable job of it. I don't know beyond that there is any other efforts, but there's plenty of individual projects.
Well, this is Ariella in my class asks whether it's possible to turn one of the books into a film or a documentary. And I would say, why not, right? As you mentioned, Eliyana, they're no longer copyrighted, right?
And I think it's another, I mean, I would even expand that the topic in terms of what I said at the beginning, like how do we actually define what these books are? What is a Yizkor Buch or Yizkor Bikher? Nowadays, you can find websites, for example, that are all about one town, and that people have contributed material about the Jewish community of that town. So that might be a Yizkor Buch. They didn't make it in time to actually print a book, but you can do it a lot cheaper online now, and it serves many of the same functions. There are also films. There are a couple films that are all about a place and the Jewish community of that place. And we might say that too is a Yizkor Buch of a sort. Now, taking a book and making it into a film, I agree with you. Why not? And there are, it would be interesting to see what to choose and how to do that. I'm sure there are filmmakers who could do something really interesting with it. I have thought about something that I would like to do is a museum exhibition. But I'm still thinking about how to do that. And I spoke with someone at a museum about it, and he said, well, you need something, physical beyond just a book. People don't just want to look at a book. And, so I've been thinking about, how to create something that people could really walk into and experience out of the books.
So Janice asks, whether you could say something about the picture of the man praying. I'm not sure which picture that was, but maybe you know, Eliyana, and where did it come from?
Yeah, that was right at the end. I showed that picture. So that's an example of, I'm not going to remember the artist right at this moment, but there are a number of pictures that get recycled through the books. And also not just pictures, but also there's words like different prayers and poems that a lot of people use. And it's clear that they're reading each other's books and getting ideas from them. And so that image, someone else has written about it. I believe Barbara Mann has written about it, but I could check exactly, that it appears in one book, and there was an actual artist who created it, but then it's was so powerful, and it didn't speak to just that place. It didn't just show imagery from that place, and then it gets used in other books because it worked. And there's others like that as well.
So where is your research taking you now? What are you focusing on at the moment?
So I'm trying to finish my semester at the moment.
Okay.
But in the summer, I hope to look at, I'm hoping to spend a couple weeks in Warsaw looking at the DP Landsmannschaft and files that are in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. I'm interested in the very early efforts to make these books, and particularly in the ones that failed, because it often took the Landsmannschaften decades to be able to complete a book. And there were often false starts. They started the project in the DP camp, and then they left. They went elsewhere, and then they started again when they first got there, but they didn't have the money. And then a few years later, they started again because they got in touch with another Landsmannschaft in another city. And I'm interested in sort of tracing those efforts, because the early ones, the ones that are published in 1946, 47, 48, 49, there's really just a handful. So why did some of them achieve that and most of them not? Is the next piece that I'm looking at. But the book that I'm hoping to write about them will go all the way from the early post-war period all the way up to the present, pretty much. I'm interested in this whole span of time and the ways that the books have developed and changed throughout that period. I don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted for a second. One of the questions was, can these books be added to now? So, for example, if descendants find info or memorabilia that could be included, how would that work? Is that possible?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So oftentimes the translations that are published either through Jewish Gen, through its own publishing house, or elsewhere, sometimes people take them elsewhere to publish them, do include additional information. And almost all of them for sure include like a new introduction. They translate the old introduction, but they say, this is why we're doing it. You know, they wrote the book for their reasons in those years. We're translating it for our reasons in these years. And on top of that, in many cases, they will put in more photographs or more documents that they've found along the way. So they certainly can be added to. And I haven't seen so much, but this is another thing. The necrologies, the lists of names of the dead, were always just what they knew in a given moment. And they put in a lot of effort to collecting those names, and they kept asking members of the Landsmannschaften to send them names, but those were never going to be complete. So in every case now, there are more names that could be added if there were online versions, or if people figured out and wanted to add to and change these volumes.
I just wanted to add to that the websites that have been created, the Polish ones, etc., of the virtual shtetls, etc., there's material being added all the time of new things that people find out, and they post it. They visit, they post it. So there's always, that is a place where you can find more material than just in the Yizkor books.
That's great. Thank you, Vivian. One of the niggling questions I have is, because you happen to mention Shelps having 3 different Yizkor Bikher, and it's such a small town. I mean, my father couldn't wait to get out of there. You know, why? How did that come about? Why would there be 3? Is it the Landsmannschaften weren't talking to each other? I mean, what? Yeah. I mean, any ideas of how that would happen?
Sherps in particular, I don't know the why, but I will say, generally speaking, sometimes somebody got in there and made a very early one. But the early ones were less participatory. They often people hadn't settled down yet. You couldn't, the Landsmannschaft in Melbourne wasn't functioning by the time the one in Buenos Aires published a book. So oftentimes later on, they would feel it didn't fulfill their needs. It maybe those people got to put what they wanted to say in it, but we didn't get to. So there might be one that came out in 52, but then another one came out in 65, just with more material in it. Sometimes there were actual fights, such as in the case of Lublin, the Landsmannschaft in Paris was quite leftist politically and didn't include, went out of their way not to include not only other groups, but also the most famous writers from Lublin. They didn't like their politics, and so they didn't put them in. And so, of course, another group, Landsmannschaft, was going to need to make another book. So it depended on the place and the time. But it is very interesting. And so I'm interested, right, in those that created multiple books, but also those that failed, that even though they kept trying, they never could quite get it together.
Yeah, so that's actually a question just for people that may not know. How many shtetls are we talking about to begin with? And how many are covered by these memory books? What's the breakdown? So, I mean, I have in mind it was something like at least over 2,000, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I would say it's something like, maybe half, but I don't know exact numbers, and that's an interesting question. But plenty of places didn't, there was never a book about, even though there was often an effort to do so.
Or there may not have been any survivors of those places as well.
Some smaller places are included in a larger town that was nearby. So if they can't find a book on its own, it's included in the nearest bigger town.
Yes, right. That's a great point, is that certainly all of the bigger cities would always say Sherps and, Kielce and Environ, the places around it, yes.
Or even smaller places. I'm thinking of Ostrovets, where my father's little village is included in that, and a whole other little towns around this town, which was just a town and nowhere as big as a city.
And that was often the case with the Landsmannschaften also, is that they represented, and the people who met together were from all the little region around. It wasn't just the single location.
Mm-hmm.
So, Eliyana, could you post again that slide of the resources? Because there's some more questions coming about that. Like, where do I go to find a particular town, a recent translation, whatever. So that would be useful again. Yeah.
Yes.
So basically, the New York Public Library, the National Yiddish Book Center, and Jewish Gen. Again, the first 2 are your most likely to have the most number of Yizkor Bikher online. And Eliyana pointed out that the Yiddish Book Center is a little bit more searchable, user-friendly than the New York Public Library. So those are three good resources. And and check your grandma's attic.
Yes.
If you can, yeah. Okay, I think that this is amazing. This might be a good moment to gesegnen sich, yeah, to say goodbye, and to thank you so much, Eliyana, for this fantastic presentation. And I mean, honestly, it just, more and more questions. We could be here all afternoon, I know, but we're going to let you go. Right, Vivian, unless you have something you would like to add, or Sharon, who's been behind the scenes, I don't know if you'd like to voice something at this moment. Sharon has also been fielding some of the questions that have come up. So yeah, I think we're in good shape for the moment. So a hartzigen Dank, dear, and the best of luck in completing the book. And I'm eager to see it when it comes out. I'm sure it'll be wonderful. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you in May and in June for our other programs. Thank you so much. Seid gesinnt. Bye.